Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, I am Nathan Smith, a host for the New Books Network. I have the pleasure today to speak with Andrew S. Berish, Associate Professor in the Department of Humanities and Culture Studies at the University of South Florida, about his book, Hating Jazz, A History of Its Disparagement, Mockery, and Other Forms of Abuse, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2025. To steal some good words from the inside flap, a deep dive into the meaning behind the hatred of jazz. A rock guitarist plays 4 notes in front of 1,000 people, while a jazz guitarist plays 1,000 notes in front of 4 people. You might laugh or groan at this jazz joke, but what is it about jazz that makes people want to disparage it in the first place? Andrew S. Berish's Hating Jazz listens to the voices who have denounced, disparaged, and mocked the music. By focusing on the rejection of the music, Berish says, we see more holistically jazz's complicated place in American cultural life. Jazz is a display of Black creativity and genius, an art form that is deeply embedded to African American life. Though the explicit racial tenor of jazz jokes has become muted over time, making fun of jazz, either in the lighthearted or aggressive way, is also an engagement with the place of Blackness in America. An individual's taste in music may seem personal, but Berish's analysis of jazz hatred demonstrates that musical preferences and trends are a social phenomenon. Criticism of jazz has become inextricable from the ways we understand race in America, past and present. In addition to this form of criticism, Berish also considers jazz hate as a form of taste discrimination and as a conflict over genre boundaries within different jazz cultures. Both enlightening and original, Hating Jazz shows that our response to music can be a social act unique to our historical moment and cultural context. We react to music in certain ways because of who we are, where we are, and when we are. And with that, Andrew, welcome.
Oh, thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, I'm happy to have you. Before we jump into the book itself, could you first say a little bit about yourself, perhaps your previous work, and how you got into this project?
Sure. I am an associate professor in the Humanities and Cultural Studies Department, as you announced, at the University of South Florida, which is in Tampa. And I'm a musicologist by training, but I live in this somewhat odd interdisciplinary department with film studies and American studies and historians. And there's another musicologist, my wife, and we both teach in this department. We teach a kind of interdisciplinary courses about, so I focus on American studies, and I'll teach if I teach a jazz course, it'd be jazz and civil rights. So there'd be a more explicit component of a social or historical nature, or I'll teach America during World War II, and we'll watch film and listen to music. I'm a musicologist by training, and a jazz drummer and a guitarist as well.
Oh, fantastic. That's awesome. Yeah, I didn't know that. We were talking earlier about like what department, how to like phrase the department. That sounds awesome. Having a more, I don't know, a little bit more of a sociocultural range of things to touch on.
I do. I enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, and it certainly comes through in the book. So I mean, we're here to talk about jazz hating.
Yes.
And first off, I want to say it was incredible, the range of, as someone who does jazz studies myself and working on with my dissertation, that it's not just the same old types of debates that take place within jazz studies. Like you open it up to more of, as you kind of framed with your department, a broader type of like, what does hating jazz mean in America in particular? Or that seems to be the focus, as like a broader cultural phenomenon.
Yeah. I mean, my first book was about how jazz swing era music kind of registered demographic and geographic movements So the music could kind of be about place or express some spatial or place experience. Um, and in some ways it's more typical. It has I transcribe a lot and talk about trying to bridge the musical world to the social world. And this book was a little different. And when I my kind of pitch about the book was that it's sort of a reception history, but from reverse. Typically reception histories often are about music that the history of a kind of music or musical style or genre and how it's received, and even in the face of ignorance, achieves success, and or draws your attention to the greatness of it that people at the time might not have realized. And I sort of flipped that around, and let's do a history of the hating of
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that kind of holds it together is you kind of set out three pillars or touchstones that kind of help provide this cohesion as you move through roughly a century of history. So to start, could you say a few words about, and I'll kind of list them out here, because you kind of make three interlocking claims about jazz hating. And that is that it is one, a social activity, two, an effective affect with an A activity, and that three, it's about race. Can you talk a little bit about those? Just unpack what those sites mean.
Yeah. I think the project sort of begins in part with a kind of longstanding fascination I've had with taste and evaluative judgments of music. How do we know what we like, and does it come from some inner sense of knowledge or that we have, or is it from critics, or is it the marketplace? And there's a enormous literature about this, and and the one thing, and I guess as my thinking developed over years in graduate school and then teaching, I've always kind of leaned toward, um, while always wanting to get into the nitty gritty of the music, the chords and the notes and, the rhythms and all the stuff we musicologists do, it always felt insufficient. It's particularly with taste. And there was this divide. And I think especially someone, if you're working in music studies or come through musicology in particular, rather than say ethnomusicology or other fields, there's this idea that meaning is, it's a longstanding trope that all you need to do is understand the music. If you understand how it's put together and whatever, then that's enough to evaluate it. And that's kind of the critical position of I think a lot of music critics, both in jazz and classical music and other fields as well. And that was just always not satisfying to me. It didn't make a lot of sense. A little self-reflection on, sort of like how I discovered my interest in jazz. It came from learning to play the drums in a high school jazz band with a teacher who gave us, it was this rich context and all these people around me kind of supporting it. And so taste really is it's a social act. And I draw on the sociologists of taste who talk about that, Bourdieu in particular, among others. But also, there is a kind of limitation in some of that taste literature, and that this Ben Highmore, a scholar, cultural studies scholar, kind of points this out, I think, really insightfully, that, yes, the social world shapes what you like, but there is this component that grips you. There's some emotional draw to the music, right? And that, and that it is something you listen to makes you feel a certain way. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel bad, excited, happy, sad, whatever it is. And so it just seemed that the two, you can't really separate the two, and that they're sometimes kind of treated separately. There's like, you judge the music as sound, or you judge it as how you feel, or you're judging it because of who you are and where you are. And it just seemed that they were all kind of intertwined. So that's two of them. But when you learn jazz and learn to play it and then study it, it's and you understand in the context, there's just no way around this, that it is about race. I mean, it's a music born from the Afro diaspora. It's a kind of signal achievement of Black creativity in the New World. It's yes, it has multicultural elements, but when you dig and you think about it, it really comes down to issues of race, particularly Blackness and African American identity. And it just seemed like the three pieces kind of all fit together. And once I kind of had that structure, the book kind of held together a little more tightly.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's you do an excellent job of weaving them because it's not, it's the kind of unfolding of the chapters doesn't exactly like map onto, oh, this one's the social chapter, this one's the affect. They are all
Yeah.
three of them are, you know, some take predominance at certain moments, but they're all very tightly interwoven throughout the three or four chapters that follow through.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, no, I it's, when I remember starting the book and seeing that, I'm like, oh, this is great. We're laying out three touch points. And, of course, then your mind is, well, is that going to structure, is that going to lay out across? But no, it was braided the entire time, which I thought it was very effective.
Oh, well, thank you.
Well, great. Let's dive in a little bit.
Sure.
Kind of jumping off on the discussion of taste. So, as jazz hate, yes, you're framing it is moving beyond what some might see as personal opinion or just right taste, in becoming, or as it becomes, a site of affirming or contesting, engaging with larger socio-cultural structures. Can you tell us a little bit about jazz's reception in the decade before World War II, so the
Right.
so-called swing era, as compared to its reception in the decade after, as they kind of move into the hi-fi
Yeah.
era?
It's so funny. When I was kind of putting so this chapter about taste, I kind of outline the history of taste and the literature about it, and then kind of jazz kind of reception history of jazz, critics and general public reception of jazz. And the examples I drew from, I drew from the uh, kind of swing era, 30s and 40s, because it's a period I know a lot about and have written before, and I kind of had an angle on there. And then I paired it with the 50s, post-war, and I actually didn't really necessarily conceptualize it as kind of pre and post-war. Uh, whatever in my mind, I kind of join them together as a kind of unit. But it makes actually that framing actually makes a lot more, makes a lot more sense. Should have highlighted.
Oh, I mean, this was all. I mean, I to put my cards on the table. I'm coming out of, or I'm in the process of writing my dissertation. I'm like, you know what, 1945, that's a good time to stop. Yeah. So I guess that's maybe I tend a little bit more in line with the timeline of your first book.
Right.
20s, 30s, 40s, so
Right.
maybe I'm just like, I don't even want to get into the bebop and the
Yeah.
second half as much.
Right. Well, yeah, and to be
Yeah.
fair, I really kind of gloss pretty quickly the post-war moment.
Yeah.
I've always been particularly fascinated with the 40s, and the war year, because the war is just part of that era, and
Yeah.
there's just tremendous change that happens, and it's a real cauldron of mixture of all kinds of things happening. The modern civil rights movement is kind of born, and the modern bureaucratic state that we know today is sort of born in that period. So, um, the and then from moving from these two decades too, there's a lot of continuity. I mean,
Yes.
the big band era kind of collapses, but the bands still live on, and there are many that get revived in the late 40s and 50s and tour, and we have videos and recordings of them, and some bands, Ellington, Basie,
Louis Armstrong, again,
Armstrong.
continuing on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just naming the big ones, but there's tons of
Yeah.
them. Um, but but yeah, I think I do trace a change, And you know what the point of continuity is in particular is, and I draw this out in the 50s section because in the film Blackboard Jungle, which is 1955, the way jazz is treated in that film is it's become the music of the adults
Yes.
rather than the youth who are delinquent. And so, see, I kind of saw the swing era, and this is kind of there's a break, but there's this real strong continuity. So in the
Absolutely.
30s, yeah, right. So in the swing era, um, there was a lot of familiar concerns about jazz, generating bad effects in youth, making them, sexualized or hyperactive or especially during World War II, there's a fear of a kind of incipient fascism, the youth being, susceptible to, mass behavior, mass movements and, undermining American individuality. But at the same time, the U.S. really wants everyone on board with the war effort and stuff. And but in the reception of jazz in the swing era, and in this my kind of very big gloss, I think you can see very clearly how jazz that there's not a kind of consensus develops that this and there's always a recognition that this music, that there's a kind of youth movement and it's exciting and popular, and that it's directly tied to Black life and to African American kind of modes of being, in the United States. And and I think the concerns were in the 30s, 40s was there was fear of the music kind of and its mass popularity and its kind of threatening this element of Blackness that seemed kind of foreign and maybe a little dangerous, threatening youth morale and that kind of thing. And and but what seemed to me more important than the criticism, which I think lots of scholars have addressed, is more about a kind of realization of channeling that energy, that music's going to generate feelings, and that's okay. And its rootedness in Black life is maybe a little threatening. The question is like, how do you harness that energy? And when we go to the post-war moment, I think there is a strong continuity here. But there is a big difference. So the big difference I already mentioned is that jazz becomes the music of the adults. So the dancers, the jitterbuggers in the 30s and 40s, they're veterans or they lived through the Second World War. Now they're adults in the 50s, and the music that was youthful to them is now adult music. And what emerges is out of this cauldron of music and change in the 40s was rhythm and blues, and then it got called rock and roll when it kind of crossed over into the white world. And Blackboard Jungle in the 50s, I use as the example as a kind of to kind of show that, again, jazz was, yes, there were people who'd always hated it or found it threatening or ugly in terms of its musical qualities or its social effects. But again, the question seemed to be, to me, was about containing it, that it's okay, music's going to move you, it's going to excite you. The question was how to kind of contain that energy. But in the 50s, though, what the complicated part here is that there's this new music with a much more direct tie to Black life, or at least a more immediate one that was kind of recognized, and that's rock and roll and rhythm and blues, and that connection was just much stronger. And so, so I use this example of kind of swing era and then the kind of post-war era and the rise of rock and roll as kind of contrasting ways of showing really how those three core ideas interact, that the reception of jazz is connected to social life, to feeling and affect, and to race.
Yeah. No, and absolutely. And that's it's always kind of an interesting thing. The classes that I've TA'd for, taught discussion groups for, is like trying to recreate the sense of like the images of jazz that I would say like most college age students today. It isn't necessarily a popular music. It is often like there are bits. It comes in here and there. It's way more complicated, but it's not the popular music.
Right.
And it was kind of it's hard to, or it's a challenge to try to like reawaken that. But I think, yeah, and I love that pairing with like the transition from this is the hit music. It's scary because, it affects people and they start dancing and blah, that type of thing. And especially pairing that with like early rock and roll and how that is a continuity where genre shifts, but these same tensions are kind of at places is what you're bringing out.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, one of the kind of discoveries, or I don't know if you want to call it that, but the conclusions I drew as I was working on the book and as I'm going into these historical moments where jazz had a kind of real effective urgency, a kind of emotional, it just meant stuff, to critics, to fans, to musicians, and you see it in the films and in the writing. And what it just seemed to me is that it's not that jazz is really hated today. It's just it doesn't have that affective, that emotional grip. It's not the site of it. It doesn't generate that affect that draws people in and makes you. It focuses some social issue or some reality of today.
Yeah. Right.
And you can, and you can educate people and I'm all for that. And the more jazz, the better. And, that's a big part of what I believe and, my life. And, but at the same time, you can't, there's certain kind of a social, fabric, a foundation that you can't really alter. And, and if you, so, it's just interesting that I think jazz today it's not that it's hate, it's just not really liked. I mean, it's it doesn't, people just say like, it's kind of part of the landscape of popular music.
Yeah, no, and it's I mean, I think one thing, and maybe this will be useful for maybe the listeners as well, is it's kind of like with this idea of like it doesn't resonate with sociocultural, and this is where you get into that kind of like the affectiveness. Is I like to mention things like cringe, like as like a social category of like, oh, that's so cringe, and and you're like, explain it, and you're like, it just is, and it like you have that like gut wrenching, like it's a bodily thing. You're like, yeah, but it's also it's a it's a social thing that I was teaching history of rock last year, and I had this student come in, and I swear to God, and she was a economics major, and I asked them, what's your why are you taking this class? What's your favorite band? And she looked at me and said Nickelback, and I was like, what the no. I would, and I grew up in rural America. Nickelback was way too big at that time. But it was interesting to see how like all of those direct generational socio-political positioning feelings that I feel in my gut still when I hear Nickelback. And this, she was just like, she goes to Yale. She's an economics major and she loves Nickelback. She doesn't feel that at all. And it's kind of she feels something else, but it's that I think that these things are like that, the way you're trying to pull those things together. In the transition.
I talk about disco a little bit.
Right.
Because and I have the same experience when I teach disco, because I often assign, or one of the things I assign is the Richard Dyer's famous essay about disco. And it's a brilliant little essay, and it's, but the students don't get it because, I mean, he's trying to defend disco.
Yeah.
And I'm old enough, I mean, not that old, but old enough to kind of understand this sort of rock versus disco discourse.
Divide, yeah.
And at least had known about the Wrigley Field. Was it Wrigley? No. Where did they blow up the disco records? Anyways.
Oh, yeah.
It
It wasn't Chicago, wasn't it?
was in Chicago.
It may have been Comiskey. I can't remember exactly.
It was Comiskey. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's Chicago people are going to yell at me.
Yeah. Oh, I'm from around there. You're good. I give you
It was Comiskey because it was a White Sox. Yeah. Disco, and I write about a little the reception, and we look back now, and there's been a lot of scholars kind of writing about this and that. And there were people at the time who definitely felt that the reception disco was both racist because it was music born in black clubs, and that it was homophobic, anti-queer, because it was also music developed and played and enjoyed in gay clubs as well. And it was that intersection of the two that was particularly kind of toxic for a lot of people. And so you outline that debate and you're like, there's people who like rock and people who like disco, and that there's these undercurrents of racism and phobia kind of in the reception of disco. And then the students don't get it at all.
Yeah.
Right? Just, to them, they like it. It's fun. It's, I think certain sounds of disco have, there is a line from disco to hip hop and EDM. And so I think it's a lot of those kind of sounds have been absorbed into our popular music world. And so disco isn't the site of this emotional investment one way or the other. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's exactly what you're saying. And so it's like, it was like a very unsuccessful lecture, because you're trying to explain, like, Dyer's doing this like amazing stuff to try to get you to understand these different ways the music embodies desire and form and all this interesting stuff. And the students are like, yeah,
they're like, yeah,
whatever you say.
No, and it's, especially, and it gets even more complicated with, I remember, like, there were so many, a couple years back, even, I can't find it, maybe it was Harry Styles, a couple years ago. He's like, a lot of his songs were popular on TikTok, and like, there was like a kind of like a neo James Brown-ish type, kind of like a heart, I don't know, groovy funk, kind of came back in a way that I think familiarized a lot of people with that type of like, I don't know, that type of like dance music in a way that like I think desensitized these things you're bringing on.
Yeah. The place that, to me, where I found the most kind of emotional engagement today with jazz was mostly from like outside the jazz community, broadly understood, the world of fans and musicians and scholars, and was outside that world was really satire and humor.
Yes.
And jazz is the kind of butt of jokes all the time. And once I started digging into this, it was just endless. Like I see stuff every day, and in fact, when I was writing it, I had to cut out tons of examples, Spinal Tap, and I don't know, they're just endless. It was just kind of endless. And it just seems like if there's one predominant way that jazz is a site of some engagement in contemporary society, it is really through humor, through satire or mockery, or I kind of separate out the more gentle ribbings of jazz from what I borrow Freud's idea of tendentious humor, where there's aggression in the humor. You're laughing, but there's an attempt to
humiliate, maybe.
Humiliate, right? Exactly. And I do talk a little bit about jazz, some humor from within the jazz world, and that can often be quite vicious. And then, the strongest effective engagement with the music today is within the jazz world, and it makes sense. It's reasonably small world, and people are deeply invested in it, whether it's their livelihood in some fashion or it's just a passion of theirs. And that's where you get, if you're people say like things that would approach hate in its strongest term, like rather than hate as a kind of strong rhetorical way, And there's a nice kind of irony here because the book, I kind of frame it a little bit with the film La La Land, Damien
Yes.
Chazelle's 2016 film, because one of the key scenes, and the one scenes that it kind of exercised the jazz world, was when in the budding relationship between Seb, Ryan Gosling, and Mia, Emma Stone, Mia says, before we get going, I should tell you, I hate jazz. And then he's like, what do you mean you hate jazz? She's like, well, I just don't like it, and it turns out she doesn't hate it like some of the other examples I give, that like the way Pat Metheny hates Kenny G. Like, it's not like that at all.
Yes.
She hates it like she doesn't like a mocha latte or something, it's, and but when you get to the toward the end of the book, when I'm talking about within the jazz community, when they say they hate something, it carries a much stronger charge. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily hate in its strongest form, which we would associate with racism and really extreme kinds of
violence,
of violence, really, but it's pretty strong, and like, I talk about Pat Metheny and this really notorious takedown of Kenny G. And I've always been fascinated by Stanley Crouch as a critic, really insightful critic and a brilliant writer. But wow, he just, when he doesn't like something, he really doesn't pull any punches. And he does a kind of really famous takedown of Miles Davis that I shocks me today, even.
Yeah, no, and we've talked about some of these splits throughout jazz history, and I think that around that era was the Pat Metheny, was that in the 80s, I imagine?
No,
in the 90s?
No, it's like 2000.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's not.
Wow. Yeah, no, I guess because it was kind of, I think, didn't he originally publish it as like a forwarded email that just kind of like, that's right, like
something like that. It was on a blog,
on a blog.
This is like early
internet. Yeah.
It was like a not Reddit, but it was like a question and answer kind of thing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, yeah, you're so what's his name? Washburn. He's
Washburn.
Yes, yeah, he's at Columbia, and he's written on Kenny G. He has I think he's the Jazz Not Jazz or Bad Music he's part of, or helped edit, and he in one of the, I believe it's in the Kenny G documentary, he talks about it as the equivalent a couple decades later of going viral. And like, and everyone is just like forwarding this, this absolute screed against Kenny G. It's circulating through email chains. And so, I guess it was a little bit later. But no, so that's good to know. So I guess that would place the Crouch and Miles debate a little bit earlier. And the little bit of the context, I guess, would be as we talked about, the transition from swing and then rock music becomes the big popular music.
Right.
And this is when you get bebop and you get a couple of more like small, early, Miles Davis, some of his earlier stuff is kind of in this zone. But then, we start, there's the kind of a fracturing around this, I want to say around the 70s-ish, where you start getting free jazz, you get fusions that mix in with rock and roll again. And I believe, and then eventually in the 80s, you get this kind of like neo bebops, like a neo 40s and 50s sound with Wynton Marsalis and Stanley Crouch. And Albert Murphy.
Yeah.
And so, this is another thing that, like, I've taught a history of jazz class, like trying to understand what could make Crouch that angry.
Yeah.
And it's that split of like, oh, he went electric. It's like when, Bob Dylan went electric and betrayed folk, like losing your roots type thing. Yeah.
Right. It's funny. Yeah. I talk about them in reverse. Like I do the Pat Metheny first, but it's true that the context is different. And Stanley Crouch is earlier, and he's writing this in the I don't know, late 80s, early 90s. Uh, and yes, yeah, but if you look at sort of what's happening around him, yeah, I mean that general story is true that with the that moment in the 50s with the rise of rock and roll and rhythm and blues, and there is a kind of um, split. Jazz loses its commercial, its more mainstream
Mainstream.
commercial
Yeah.
appeal. It also under various kind of aesthetic movements, it starts splintering into different kind of hard bop and cool jazz, and all these genres also kind of align with kind of have their racial politics as well, and then you move into free jazz and or the avant-garde, and there's various splits there, and so the tree of jazz kind of, the branches kind of, you have all these other kind of phrases. And of course, famously, Miles Davis kind of sees the rise of rock music in particular in the 60s, and kind of sees the massive growth of these enormous stadiums, and thinks, there's something there, right? There's both something, um, and I think honestly, aesthetically, musically appealing, and also commercially appealing as well. And this is the moment Stanley Crouch kind of settles on, and he
Yeah.
he particularly, I mean, the essay is called "On the Corner of the Sellout of Miles Davis," and
Yeah.
he sees. But there's a few interesting things. One, that I also find the essay fascinating because he puts the decline of Miles even earlier than I would. He's critical of even the classic second quintet, the Tony Williams, Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Like Miles
which
Smiles era.
Miles, exactly, which is really naughty, complicated avant-garde jazz. It kind of sits between mainstream and the avant-garde world, and so that sort of fascinates me. But Stanley Crouch, it becomes, the Miles Davis becomes a kind of signifier for a kind of broader change in Black American culture, with the rise of, he calls it blaxploitation culture, and with blaxploitation film, but also the emergence of hip hop and rap, and other associated things. He basically sees it as a kind of neo minstrelsy, um, and so the sellout of Miles Davis is a kind of sellout of a particular notion of Black culture, a particular notion of Black masculinity, into something else that he finds kind of appalling. And so it's a fascinating article. It's a fascinating glimpse. Initially, what drew me to it is I was trying to find, like, what's a really extreme, contemptuous evaluation of jazz, and it's one of the most contentious and contemptuous. I mean, he just has no space, excuse me, no patience for this. And that was really interesting, and it was worth kind of unpacking. And I don't, I don't agree, but I don't, the point I think I was just trying to make is like, uh, to try to draw out where is this intensity coming from,
Yeah.
to describe that intensity, but to kind of locate it in this particular moment in time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I guess with that, uh, um, like I mean, like you mentioned like blaxploitation films, and like I think of, there's the Sun Ra movie, Space is the
Oh
Place,
yeah.
which is like another, it's a similar type of, like, you have at least the three camps of, there's the kind of, as he frames it, the corrupt Black Panthers, there's the politics of respectability, kind of like wear suit and tie, and I'm assimilating to the white world, which is his name's Fay, which I imagine is short for
Yes,
Au
yes.
Fay, and then
Yeah.
there's his kind of like psychedelic spirituality
Right.
approach. And it's so with the um the the Crouch Davis debate, there is a similar type of like, what is the future, or what is the tradition, and how should it be mobilized for like within the Black community. And so that kind of like positioning, I wanted to flip it back over to uh
Yeah.
Matheny, Kenny G, because I think self-positioning and its relationship to Blackness, but kind of the inverse takes place.
Yeah.
And I was just curious, like how you see race kind of, you know, like how that helps crank up the heat on Matheny's screed.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's it, it. In some ways, it's yeah, it's more complicated. Only because um, it seems like you have two white musicians are or it's they're not arguing because it's really one person yelling at another person who's not listening.
Yes.
Uh, but so yeah, so I mean, the core of this is what really animates Pat Metheny's animus here is that it was a record Kenny G released where he overdubbed his sax playing with
Yes.
jazz legends. And the track that particularly exercised Metheny was What a Wonderful World that Louis Armstrong recorded.
Yeah.
And it's a late Louis Armstrong record. It's one of the last things he did, I think. And this is where he calls it an act of musical necrophilia, defying an icon. And he really thinks this is what he wrote. I have a little quote right here.
Sure.
Kenny G decided it was appropriate for him to this is Pat Metheny's words, not mine. But when Kenny G decided it was appropriate for him to defile the music of the man who's probably the greatest jazz musician that's ever lived by spewing his lame-ass jive, sooty, bluesy, out-of-tune, noodling, wimped out, effed up, laying all over one of great Lewis's tracks, he did something I would not have imagined possible. So the point where Metheny cares, and it's an issue of effective engagement, right? So at Metheny, he starts his tirade. He's like, look, for years, I didn't care who Kenny G was. He to me, played a little sharp. He had some skill, but I was just not interested. But as soon as I heard this, he's defiling a jazz icon. And not only a jazz icon, but, the kind of the figure most, I mean, if we're going to cite someone who kind of builds jazz in the modern image, sort of after first wave of New Orleans musicians or that early, those kind of transitional ragtime early jazz musicians, it's Louis Armstrong. It's this black man who moves from New Orleans and Chicago and, just transforms the music for New York musicians and Chicago musicians. And it really becomes about tradition. And really, he's not saying it directly, but it's pretty clear that he means this is a Black tradition in particular. And that, again, it's like when you read it and the context, it's all very clear that Kenny G is this kind of white appropriator, whereas Pat Metheny, a serious musician who has learned the tradition, and there's no question Pat Metheny can play in that tradition, and he studied Parker solos, and he can do that. He can do what he's honor the tradition, and Kenny G clearly doesn't. And the documentary, there's a really excellent documentary on HBO about G, and he's a complicated guy, and and there's some truth to what Metheny's saying is that he does seem pretty clueless about jazz history or Black history in general, and he doesn't seem to care that much. On the other hand, he practices all the time and he listens to all kinds of stuff, and I don't know, he's a complicated guy and a complicated documentary.
I think one of my favorite moments in that documentary is I played this for my class when we were talking about smooth jazz, and it's the moment where they ask him point blank, like, do you think your whiteness, I mean, he's Jewish, he was raised, he's white for his purposes and for the perception. And there's this great moment. He goes, no, wait, well, now that I finally think about it for the first time, it's kind of this like staging of like, I think being white has helped me, but he's a complicated guy, but he certainly, he hits the woodshed, like he puts in the hours, and plays such a wide variety.
And maybe this was the easy way to go, but it just seemed too obvious that Pat Metheny, there's not a little, but Pat Metheny is someone who's had one foot in the smooth jazz world broadly understood. I mean, um, his early work after he's playing with Gary Burton and people like that
Mm.
is with his Pat Metheny group is a kind of fusion of pop and various
Yeah.
strands of jazz. And he's had some, a great deal of commercial success, maybe more than similar musicians, in part because he has kind of one foot in both worlds.
Yeah.
And so there's a little kind of, you know, projection, like Kenny G is a little bit of himself. And then,
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
hard not to see it as him kind of attacking this part of maybe himself that he, he's questioning or maybe doesn't like.
Yeah. No. And I mean, in some sense, um, I don't want to. This isn't quite the right phrase for it, but it's almost like he kind of has this fusiony, quasi new wave-ish sound. I don't know.
Yeah,
That is, I guess, kind of like dad rock, or it could be read as dad rock. They're
sure.
kind of like a white, wearing jeans. I think some of his early albums, he's like sitting in a garage on a car. It's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
suburban, I guess, in a certain
Yeah, yeah.
too.
David Icke, the
Yeah.
scholar David Icke, has a great essay about. It's in one of his books
Oh yes,
about the image and it's kind of and kind of
white masculinity, I believe.
white masculinity.
Yeah,
Not urban; it's kind of rural. And
yeah,
there's other musicians uh, that have kind of played with that a little bit, or
sure.
that's been part of their image.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, so but I think that like really brings out, which that is both a distinguishing thing between his relationship to the tradition, and his is especially like I guess kind of that reference that he's like, yeah, sometimes I sound like I'm doing smooth jazz, but I mean, I would never defile, the grandfather of jazz, the
right.
Louis Armstrong type thing is kind of
Yeah, yeah,
setting some
yeah.
boundary
Yeah, yeah,
lines.
exactly. Right, right. This kind of experimentation, this might be okay, but this
Yeah.
crosses a line. And but it's a great example because it shows you how the issue of race is so central that
Mhm.
it's there is a discourse within the jazz scholarship that and it echoes a little bit the discourse in the larger society that we're focusing too much on race and it's about
Yeah.
musical skill and ability and it's this great international language and but that's just, I mean, that's just kind of ignoring the reality of this music and its history and its origins and that's okay. I mean, you just, that this is, it's just, this is the way to understand the music and its place in American life, that it has always been this kind of both a kind of window and a mirror between
Yes.
across the color line.
Yeah, for sure.
And Eric Lott had his most recent book was called The Black Mirror,
Oh
and
yeah.
it was about this, and I found that a very helpful kind of frame that it's not that like I do think there are moments where jazz has been able to bridge the color line or at least reveal things about reveal a way America could be uh, socially, but at the same time, it's hard not to, you read jet history and to see musicians kind of thinking they're engaging with Black culture, but in a way they're just kind of reflecting kind of what they think they see back onto themselves. And it becomes more reflection on their identity,
Yeah.
their whiteness in the face of Blackness or their ethnic identity in the face of some normative Protestant mainstream
Yeah.
American identity or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that goes back, and you mentioned it a couple times, but like especially with a lot of, the Lott's early books, as Love and Theft, which is about
Yes.
minstrelsy, and how often had less to do with any representation. Well, had to do with representation, but not like a reality of Black life, but
Right.
using Blackness as the ability for white people to experiment in a certain
Yeah.
way of like,
Yeah.
you have Irish immigrants in the 19th century kind of being able to go, I'm going to put on blackface. I'm going
Right.
to do a minstrel song, quote unquote, but it really is just kind of like an Irish jig, but they're a different, I guess, kind of like bodily world has opened up, a different expressive palette that they aren't able to do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that has anything to do with Black life, or is doesn't have its own like problematic entanglements.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Um, yeah, I mean, I've had you on for a while, but I do want to. We've hit a lot of the like particular things, especially some of the big debates within the jazz community.
Right.
Um, I wanted to jump back a little bit to your discussion of humor because I thought that was the part where you were able to bring out some of the like widest ramifications, and I guess kind of like the large it hating jazz is kind of like a larger cultural American expression. For instance,
Right.
I mean, I love the H. John Benjamin album. I'm happy to talk about that. I think there's so many layers, and I thought you did an excellent job of like
Oh,
pulling out his kind of self-loathing as like the butt of the joke.
right.
But also, especially for the listeners, I think also the Dwight and Angela scene from The Office is like
Yes.
a telling confirmation of like a larger socio-cultural, I don't know, engagement that has nothing to do with actual jazz, but
Yes.
you mentioned how like it isn't affectively marked, I guess, in a lot of people's lives, but it still has this like legacy of being kind of the butt of the joke or a
Yes.
means to make a joke.
Right. 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 It's funny. Humor has a kind of inherent ambiguity about it. It's probably part of what makes things funny, but
Yeah.
so the H. John Benjamin. So if people haven't, he's a comedian based in Los Angeles. He does a lot of uh, voice acting work, but he did a record called "Well, I Should Have Learned to Play the Piano," and he says if people haven't heard it, it's weird and brilliant and genuinely funny.
It's very fun.
And because he's and there's these videos supporting it where it's like he wants to do a jazz record, and he doesn't play piano. And not only that, he doesn't play jazz, and he even says, "I don't
I
like
like jazz, which is why I thought it'd be funny to make a jazz piano record. Yeah, it's like
and the so initially you seem like maybe he's making fun of jazz, like, oh, anyone can play it, or it's just noodling, which is one of the common complaints if you search Google or Reddit boards or whatever. Why do you hate jazz? It's like it's boring, it's chaotic, it's just noodling. Yeah, and so he's kind of starting from that point, but then when you watch him and then you kind of get into it, you realize like, oh no, he's making a jerk. I mean, he's making an ass of himself, like deliberate.
Yeah.
And that the humor is really him. And the jazz is a MacGuffin. It's like it's a vehicle to kind of show his incompetency. And in fact, that is a large part of his kind of comic persona. He wrote a book about his failures in life.
Yeah.
Whereas the Dwight and Angela, that's what, when you talk about people making fun of jazz, this example comes up all the time. So it seemed like important. And that one was interesting. It people have disagreed with me on this. It seems more tendentious to me than these other examples like H. John Benjamin. Partly, I think, because in some ways it's an easy joke because you're reaching for something that is like everyone in the audience is going to be like, oh yeah, and we're not stupid, and it's a complicated. Again, there is some ambiguity because Dwight and Angela are like not portrayed as the brightest people, and they're characters, and they're doing stupid things, right? Yeah. And Dwight's trying to tell Angela, well, you're not stupid, but jazz is stupid, and it kind of can read in different ways, like either they're stupid that they don't understand that jazz is not stupid and that it's great, but I've always read it that it's a way that it's bringing us into the joke. And I kind of use Freud to, that we're kind of the audience for the joke and that we're the third part that's going to make this thing work. because yeah, these I'm looking at we might be stupid, but we're not as stupid as jazz, and
Yeah. Right.
it seemed to do a lot of interesting work, and I think a lot of the humor chapter, I kind of end on this idea of that ambiguity, and I try to bring it back to race because like what is the target of the jazz humor? What are you satirizing? And there is this ambiguity that I think is really interesting. I try to hold off any broader judgments. I just really wanted to point out that um, race is kind of always present because are you making fun of this, black art form? Are you making fun of the white appropriators of the form? Are you making fun of the people who think they're smart because they like this music, whether it's good or bad, And that target it's not always made clear. And it really doesn't have to be for the humor to work, but it seemed like I found it like a very satisfying conclusion to write because it really, again, wrapped together all the things that when you're laughing at jazz, it is a fundamentally social thing because it's funny because like someone's saying what maybe we're all thinking. Jazz is stupid. They don't know what they're doing, right? It's fundamentally about affect, right? Humor is about generating affect of a laugh, a joke, a smile, good feelings, pleasurable feelings, also bad feelings, aggressive feelings. That's sort of the Freudian contribution here. And that it is also always about race when you're making fun of jazz. It's just inevitable. And that's a kind of a deeper truth of American cultural history. And I thought it was a really excellent way to get at that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and I remember reading that chapter. It made me think back to the first time that my first, I heard a jazz joke. And I don't think I got it at the time, but it was in I can't remember if you wrote about it. Maybe you did, and that's what made me think of it. It was in SpongeBob. I don't know if you know the one.
No,
yeah.
I no.
Okay, yeah. There's he's trying to be an adult, and SpongeBob and Patrick are talking, and he goes, "You have to acquire a taste for free-form jazz."
Oh,
and they sit there, like thinkers. But what's playing in the background is like Latin fusion. And like that, and it's constitutively not like what someone would read as freeform jazz. And that never,
right.
and I remember going back and going like, oh yeah, it's like that joke. It's like, oh yeah, this is just what adults do. It's what no one really likes it. You just kind of have to pretend. Like those are some of these like tropes that are coming up. But then I went back and I'm like, oh my God, it isn't even free jazz. Like, which adds another layer of like what, kind of this, I guess the ambiguity and the shifting of like, as you were kind of listing that the various perspectives one could make toward it,
right,
and how they all kind of triangulate in these way or around affect, sociality, or community. I guess, as well as in its relation to race.
Right.
Depending on your perspective, those three things do seem to like. I guess be like not intention in like a negative way, but they seem to like kind of define the parameters of how it's being or how it's functioning.
I think that's right.
Well, I've had you for quite some time.
Oh,
but so is there anything else you want?
All this, so.
Oh, you know what? I listen. You did. I listened to yours. The first one you did. The local.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Lonesome Roads. I do it while I do my dishes. It keeps me sane. So hopefully someone does. I'll send it to my mom. She'll love it. So, but I do want to give you the opportunity. Is there anything else? Like I said, it's a very rich work in which all three of these things are constantly being braided throughout.
Yeah.
Is there any particular strand or approach, or like site that we didn't bring up that you want to draw attention to?
Yeah. It's funny because it came up that I thought as an example of thing I might miss, but women in jazz seems it would be an oversight not to talk about it at least briefly, and that actually sounds kind of tokenism, and I don't mean it to sound.
I will signal for our listeners. It was it's also part of the subtext of the Crouch Miles Davis.
It is very
Just to like, we were we were discussing, it was in the background between us,
yes.
but just to make it a little bit more, to tie it back in.
Yeah. If racism is a component of jazz reception over its history, broadly understood, then misogyny and sexism are too. And I kind of go in and separate the two words out, but really, the place of jazz, of women in jazz, has been as kind of there have been lots of women jazz musicians from the very beginning who have made important contributions but have fought it's a shifting culture, but it certainly from the swing era on, and definitely by the bebop era, it is a very masculinist culture, built on uh, uh, jam sessions, cutting sessions, and a kind of there's a kind of aggressive milieu, masculine milieu of jazz as well. And a lot of the satirical attacks on jazz have, I think, pointed out or played on things that kind of challenge gender norms or highlight jazz's uber masculinity, or for a long time musicians were seen as kind of effeminate. So there's kind of ambiguity on those attacks as well. And so I have a section where I talk about some of the most kind of tendentious attacks on jazz. Contemptuous attacks are often directed at female jazz musicians or at female listeners of jazz. And when I move into the last chapter, because I wanted to kind of reflect on, there is some ideas out there, some scholarly models and a kind of discursive world of that, where we hate things together, hating on things. Or there was a feature in was it the AV Club for a long time called the worst songs, like when they got famous people to kind of talk about the song that they hate the most, and
Yeah.
like that. And that there some people have written, I think very intelligently, that it creates a kind of social unity, and it can be progressive. It can have some progressive political ends. I ultimately don't come down on that side, because I think in the end, there's this great quote that this sociologist, or he was a political scientist, C. Fred Alford, wrote. He's like, the lie of hatred is that it can connect a person with others as love does. But he says, hatred is not the opposite of love, only an imitation of it, love in the realm of malevolence. That's a fantastic quote. And ultimately, that's where I come, because in that aggressive, contemptuous world, whether it's within the jazz community or without, it's hard to see that kind of world functioning as an inclusive place, inclusive of gender difference, of sexual difference, of racial difference. It does seem, I don't know, it strikes me as like not a productive way to organize a kind of culture and to, make it thrive, in the future. So I did want to kind of bring those things up before we ended.
Yeah, no, and just to, we didn't necessarily weave it into this telling or, or our kind of meandering, but those two threads, although, especially in those, I think it's the fourth and the fifth chapter, they come up in particular, but they've been, like I said, this is a very densely braided, in a productive, not dense in a bad way. But they are deeply imbricated issues. I mean, like we spent a long time, just I guess for the listeners' sake, with the Davis Crouch debate, and here we have two black men fighting over the future of blackness. And as you I think you noted that isn't it called Jazz on the Corner or something to that effect?
Yeah, On the Corner.
Yeah, which is obviously about like prostitution, and there's kind of the effeminateness of pop culture, and he's selling out the strong black masculinity. That would be Crouch's, I guess, kind of approach to it, which is then echoed also on the Kenny G theme. Kenny G is, it's light music, it's R&B adjacent, easy listening, these types of things.
Yeah.
even and disco. So I mean, like these are yeah, just to like
Right.
and some of the I guess ills that we brought out of like some of those most intense I guess approaches, um, and how they like I guess kind of like tie in with issues of like I guess kind of an intersectional thing,
Right.
intersectional knot that you weave in and out of throughout the entire text. So yeah, thank
I
you.
try. I tried.
Um, so I know you just finished a book. It's
Yeah.
hot as hell. But are you working on anything now? Do you have any future plans you want to share with us, or
Oh,
you just going to enjoy
well,
your summer?
mostly I'll try to enjoy my summer. I've had a longstanding interest to write a biography of Charlie Barnett, who I wrote about in my first book.
Oh, yeah.
Um, yeah, he's a kind of an unsung kind of figure. He's not as well known as Benny Goodman or R.D. Shaw in terms of white band leaders, or of course Ellington and Basie in terms of black leaders, or even Jimmy Lunsford and people like that. But I think my angle on Barnett is I think he's a good figure to explore that early '40s world of America, and he's just a really colorful character. He's a kind of rock star, like before the letter, so to speak. He's they did drugs and he was married 7 times or something, 8 times.
Yeah.
And, a real character, came from money and gave it all up and kind of slumming it in the jazz world. But he also hired black arrangers and black musicians and tried to desegregate his band. And I just think he's an interesting figure that hasn't really been written about. So that's a kind of long-term project, try to dig up what I can find. And I think that'd be an interesting story to tell, kind of return to my pre-World War II jazz roots.
And if you want to thread it in, I mean, in my dissertation, I'm talking about corniness. There is one, you mentioned a couple of these throughout, like the
Yes.
I think it's in the humor, the like Casa Loma group doing the white jazz, black jazz.
Yes,
But
yes.
Charlie Barnett has a good one.
The right thing and the wrong thing.
Yeah, the right idea, wrong idea.
Yes.
Where the wrong idea is the corny one, the right idea is like really intense swing,
Well,
yeah,
someday soon, when you're done and your book comes out, I'll interview you because this corniness and that's like also something I'm totally interested in. And
yeah, I look forward to hearing about it. There isn't much written about Charlie Barnett. I mean, I think he has like an autobiography or
it does, yeah.
But because I wanted to find more about just those 2 songs. I'm not really focusing on it, but
right.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. Yeah, I look forward to it.
Oh well, yeah, we'll see.
You'll sell at least one book,
10 years or I don't know. God knows.
All right. Well, Andrew, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this.